Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're tackling a seriously fascinating historical and archaeological puzzle. How ancient texts, specifically the biblical source material, actually survived across millennia. Okay, let's dive into this, because honestly, whether you're coming at this as a historian, a data scientist, or theologian, the mechanics of how these documents survived are just absolutely mind-blowing. Right out of the gate, our sources highlight this really brilliant philosophical contrast about how an all-knowing being might actually interact with human history. So in the Islamic tradition, there's this concept about older scriptures where the human process of copying and translating allowed for changes or errors known as tarif. So the Quran is viewed as that final, perfectly preserved correction. But on the flip side, the Judeo-Christian perspective takes a totally different route. They argue for proof by volume. The idea here is that the survival of thousands of remarkably consistent ancient documents is the actual proof that the core message stayed perfectly intact, completely despite human involvement. Which brings us to a pretty wild thought experiment. Just imagine for a second that you're an all-knowing, all-powerful being, standing entirely outside of time and space. You've got a message, and you need to secure it against the inevitable rise and fall of empires, human error, and just the sheer decay of time. So how do you do it? Do you hide one single indestructible copy in a cave somewhere? Or do you take a completely different approach? Well, the source material argues that the historical transmission of these texts functioned exactly like a modern distributed database. Think of it like a massive, multi-century relay race. Since these texts were so vital to early communities, they were constantly frantically being copied by hand. Meaning, if someone tried to change a verse over in Rome, the copies down in Egypt or over in Jerusalem would immediately show the discrepancy. By scattering the puzzle pieces literally everywhere, you create a system where any corruption is just instantly detectable. So here's the roadmap for the explainer. We're going to look at Layer 1, the anchor, Layer 2, the Greek witness, Layer 3, off-site backups, and finally, a mathematical impossibility. Let's start right in with Layer 1, the anchor. The foundation of this whole system rests on some real archaeological heavy hitters. We're talking the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered back in 1947, which suddenly gave us over 200 biblical manuscripts. And then, way on the other end of the timeline, you've got the Masoretic texts, specifically the famous Aleppo and Leningrad codices. Put them together, and these artifacts form this massive, unshakable base for our historical pyramid. Now, I want you to really think about the number 1000 here. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls popped up, our oldest Hebrew manuscripts only dated back to around 900 AD. The scrolls pushed that timeline back a full 1,000 years, all the way to 250 BC and even earlier. And when scholars actually sat down and compared these texts, separated by a literal millennium, they were stunned. The text was practically identical. I mean, it's a 1,000-year game of telephone where the message just didn't change. So how on earth is that even possible? Well, it all comes down to the Masoretic scribes. These guys copied the texts with an obsessive, almost exhausting level of detail. I mean, they literally counted every single letter and every single space on a page just to make absolutely sure they hadn't added or dropped a single stroke. This incredibly deep, painstaking devotion, that was the very first layer of our historical security system. Which brings us to Layer 2, the Greek witness. If the Tanakh is our anchor, the New Testament is the massive, widespread completion of that structure. As of today, archaeologists have cataloged over 5,800 complete or fragmented ancient Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, just a huge spread, ensuring the text was never isolated to just one region or controlled by one central authority. But it doesn't even stop at Greek. When you factor in all the ancient translations of the text into Latin, Syriac, and Coptic, that number absolutely explodes to over 25,000 ancient versions. These copies were stashed away in completely different climates and libraries, basically ensuring that if a war or natural disaster completely wiped out one region, the texts were safely surviving in another. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of what we're talking about here. You've got over 25,000 manuscript copies for the New Testament. Do you know how many copies exist for your average famous ancient historical book? About a dozen. Just 12. The sheer volume of evidence for this particular text just completely overshadows literally any other document in ancient history. Now, buried within this mountain of evidence, we have the Codex Sinaiticus. This is a massive 4th century manuscript that holds the oldest complete copy of the New Testament in Greek. It acts as a massive anchor for this second layer, proving that by the 300s, the books of the New Testament were already gathered up, organized and being preserved exactly the way they're recognized today. Moving right along to Layer 3, off-site backups. So, while the New Testament spread primarily in Greek, researchers like Nehemiah Gordon and Dr. Miles Jones have highlighted this really vital, independent Hebrew trail. They point to things like the Shem Tov Matthew, which is a Hebrew version preserved deep within Jewish rabbinic archives. And even crazier, Dr. Jones's research points to the Kachin Hebrew New Testament, which was preserved by Jewish communities all the way in India. These communities were completely outside the reach of the Roman world. It is literally like finding a backup copy of a file saved on a totally disconnected hard drive on another continent. And the cool part is, modern technology just keeps uncovering more of this hidden trail. Recently, researchers using ultraviolet light managed to discover a 1750-year-old fragment of the Gospel of Matthew written in Old Syriac, which is a dialect of Aramaic closely related to Hebrew. It had been literally hidden under layers of other writing for over 1,000 years. This kind of multilingual layer means texts were constantly being translated back and forth, making it phenomenally difficult for the original message to ever be lost or secretly altered. All of this leads us to our final point, a mathematical impossibility. When you zoom out and look at all of this together, you start to see this incredibly robust triple-check system. You've got the Tanakh being rigorously preserved by the Masoretes, you've got the Greek New Testament spreading far and wide across the entire Roman world, and then you have the Hebrew New Testament preserved in these isolated little pockets like India and rabbinic archives. If anyone, anywhere tried to maliciously alter the text over in Europe, those isolated copies in India or the Middle East would just instantly expose the forgery. So the crucial point is this. When you line up all these distinct layers, the anchor in Hebrew, the spread in Greek and Latin, and those isolated backups in Hebrew and Aramaic, they all point to the exact same core truth. This completely scattered, multilingual, multi-continental database forms one single, remarkably consistent picture. Our source material sums up this whole perspective with a really profound thought. It says, he used the passage of time itself to prove the message stayed true. According to this view, God didn't preserve the word by making it physically impossible for a human to scratch out a word on a single piece of parchment. Instead, the historical documentation itself, just the sheer, overwhelming volume of evidence, is the actual proof of preservation. It really is such a captivating way to look at ancient history. By basically flooding time and space with thousands of copies, the very human habit of copying things actually became the ultimate security system. So I want to leave you with this to ponder. Does the sheer volume of history and this massive distributed network of texts change how you view divine preservation? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.